Every hospital has nurses who go above and beyond. But Helen Richardson did something that most people couldn't understand. For 25 years, she stayed late after every shift at St. Luke's Medical Center in Boston. Not because she was behind on paperwork. Not because she was getting paid overtime. But because she would go to the ICU, find the patients in comas, the ones with no visitors that day, and she would read to them. Out loud. For hours. Shakespeare, mysteries, romance novels, the newspaper, anything. Nurses who worked with her thought it was sweet but strange. Doctors dismissed it as superstition. Some family members found it touching. Others found it weird. But Helen never stopped. Never missed a night. For a quarter century, she was the voice in the darkness for people who couldn't respond, couldn't acknowledge her, couldn't even let her know if they heard. And no one knew why. No one understood what drove her to spend her own time, her own energy, reading to unconscious strangers. Until her very last patient, a man named Robert Hayes, woke up after 2 months in a coma. And what he told the hospital staff about what Helen had been doing and why she'd been doing it brought an entire medical center to its knees in tears. Because sometimes the most beautiful acts of love are born from the deepest pain. And Helen Richardson had been carrying a pain for 25 years that she transformed into a mission no one saw coming. Let's go back to 1998. Helen was 42 years old, an experienced ICU nurse, good at her job, respected by her colleagues. She was married to David, a high school teacher. They had one son, Marcus, who was 19 years old and in his second year at Boston University studying engineering. Marcus was their whole world. A smart, kind young man who called his mother every Sunday, who came home for dinner twice a month, who'd always been close to his parents in a way that made them feel blessed. Life was good. Stable. Normal. The kind of normal that makes you forget how fragile everything is. On a Friday night in October, Marcus went to a party with friends near campus. He wasn't a big drinker, wasn't reckless, was always responsible. But he accepted a ride home from someone who'd had too much to drink. Someone who made a terrible decision that ended in Marcus's car wrapped around a telephone pole on Commonwealth Avenue. The driver walked away with minor injuries. Marcus didn't walk away at all. The call came at 2 a.m. Helen was working a night shift when hospital security found her and told her Marcus had been brought to the ER. Head trauma. Critical condition. Helen ran through the halls of her own hospital, still in her scrubs, and found her son unconscious, hooked to machines, his beautiful face swollen and broken. David arrived 20 minutes later. The doctors told them Marcus had suffered severe traumatic brain injury. He was in a coma. They didn't know if he'd wake up. If he did wake up, they didn't know what kind of recovery he'd have. All they could do was wait and hope. Helen took family leave. For 3 weeks, she never left Marcus's bedside. She held his hand, talked to him constantly, played his favorite music, read him sports news and updates about his engineering classes. She'd heard stories about coma patients who could hear, who remembered voices, who found their way back because someone kept talking to them. She wasn't going to let Marcus be alone in the darkness. David came every day after teaching, sat with Helen and Marcus, but he couldn't stay overnight. Someone had to keep working, keep the insurance, keep their lives from completely falling apart. So Helen stayed alone with Marcus through the nights, reading, talking, praying, begging him to come back. But Marcus never did. After 3 weeks, his brain swelling hadn't decreased. The doctors did more scans. The news was devastating. Marcus's brain damage was catastrophic. He wasn't going to wake up. He wasn't going to recover. He was effectively gone, even though his body was still breathing with the help of machines. They recommended withdrawing life support. Helen refused. She wasn't ready. She couldn't let go. David gently tried to help her understand that Marcus was already gone, that keeping him on machines was just prolonging their pain, but Helen couldn't accept it. It took another week before Helen finally agreed. She held Marcus's hand as they removed the ventilator. David was on one side, Helen on the other. They told Marcus they loved him, that it was okay to go, that they'd be okay. And Marcus died quietly, peacefully, with his parents beside him. He was 19 years old. He'd been in a coma for 4 weeks. And Helen hadn't left his side except for bathroom breaks and brief moments to eat. The grief nearly destroyed her. The guilt was worse. Because 3 days after Marcus died, one of his friends came to the house and mentioned that Marcus had been alone at the hospital for about 2 hours on the first night, before Helen had been notified and arrived. The hospital had been short-staffed, Marcus had been stabilized but unconscious, and there simply hadn't been anyone available to sit with him until his parents got there. 2 hours. Marcus had been scared and alone and dying for 2 hours before his mother could reach him. Helen became obsessed with that thought. Her son had been in the worst moment of his life, confused and terrified if any part of him was aware, and there had been no one there. No hand to hold. No voice to comfort him. No one to tell him he was loved and not alone. Helen spiraled into depression, barely functional, barely able to work. David was grieving too, but he was trying to hold them both together, trying to get Helen to therapy, to talk to someone, to process the trauma. But Helen kept saying the same thing. Marcus was alone. I should have been there sooner. He was alone. 6 months after Marcus died, Helen returned to work at St. Luke's. She couldn't stay home anymore. The emptiness was suffocating. But being back in the ICU, seeing coma patients, seeing families keeping vigil, it triggered her constantly. Until one night, during a slow shift, Helen walked past a room with a coma patient who had no family present. The woman had been brought in after a stroke, no identification, no next of kin located yet. She was alone. And something inside Helen broke open. Helen went into that room, pulled up a chair next to the woman's bed, and started talking to her. She introduced herself. She said, "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here. You're not alone. I'm going to sit with you." And then Helen picked up a magazine from the nurse's station and started reading articles out loud. Celebrity gossip. Recipes. Advice columns. It didn't matter. She just read. For an hour, until her shift ended. And when she left, she felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months. Purpose. The next night, Helen did it again. Same patient, still unconscious, still alone. Helen read her a mystery novel this time, a paperback someone had left in the break room. By the third night, the woman had been identified and family had arrived, so Helen moved to another room. Another coma patient. Another person alone. This time a man who'd overdosed, no visitors, just machines keeping him breathing. Helen read him the newspaper. Sports scores. Weather. Stock market. Local news. She talked to him like he was a person, not a diagnosis. Over the following months, it became Helen's routine. Every shift, after her official duties were done, she'd find the coma patients who had no visitors that day. She'd sit with them for an hour, sometimes 2. She'd read whatever she could find. Books, magazines, even hospital brochures when nothing else was available. Other nurses noticed and thought it was sweet but slightly odd. Some asked her why she did it. Helen would just say, "Because they're alone. No one should be alone." But she never told anyone the real reason. She never told them about Marcus, about the 2 hours he'd been alone, about the guilt that consumed her. She never explained that she was trying to make sure no other person in a coma was alone the way her son had been. That every hour she spent reading to unconscious strangers was an hour she was making up for the time she hadn't been there for Marcus. It was her penance. Her mission. Her way of surviving the grief that would have swallowed her otherwise. 25 years passed. Helen never stopped. She read to hundreds of coma patients over those years. Some woke up, some didn't. The ones who woke usually didn't remember the reading, but occasionally someone would mention a voice, a story, something comforting in the darkness. Helen never took credit. She just moved on to the next patient, the next person who needed a voice in their void. By 2023, Helen was 67 years old, planning to retire in a few months. She'd spent a quarter-century doing this private act of love, this quiet mission that no one fully understood. And then Robert Hayes was admitted to the ICU after a massive heart attack. 71 years old, widowed, estranged from his adult son, living alone. He'd collapsed in his apartment and hadn't been found for almost a day. By the time he reached St. Luke's, his brain had been without adequate oxygen for too long. He fell into a coma. No visitors. No family. Just another alone patient in the ICU. Helen sat with Robert every night for 2 months. She read him everything she could find. She told him about the weather, about hospital gossip, about a new restaurant that opened down the street. She played him classical music from her phone. She held his hand and told him he wasn't alone, that someone cared, that he mattered. The doctors said Robert would likely never wake up, that his brain activity was minimal. But Helen didn't stop. She never stopped. And then, on a Thursday evening in November, Robert's eyes opened. Just a flutter at first, then fully open, confused and disoriented. The monitors beeped alerts, nurses rushed in, doctors were called. Robert was awake. After 2 months, against all odds, he was conscious. Helen was there when it happened, still holding his hand from her evening reading session. Robert looked at her, tried to speak but couldn't yet, and Helen pressed the call button while saying softly, "Welcome back. You're safe. You're at St. Luke's. You're going to be okay." Over the next several days, Robert's recovery was slow but steady. Speech returned. Memory returned. Cognitive function was remarkably intact for someone who'd been in a coma so long. The medical staff called it a miracle. Robert called it something else. He called it Helen. Because Robert remembered. Not everything but enough. He remembered being trapped in darkness. He remembered being terrified and confused. But he also remembered a voice. A woman's voice reading to him. Talking to him. Telling him he wasn't alone. He said that voice was the only thing that kept him tethered to life, that gave him something to hold on to when he could have let go and drifted into death. That voice had been his lifeline. When Robert was strong enough to talk more fully, he asked the staff who the woman was. The nurse who'd been reading to him every night. The staff said that must have been Helen. She did that for coma patients. Robert asked to see her, to thank her. They brought Helen to his room, and Robert started crying. He held her hands and said, "You saved my life. Not just medically. Spiritually. I was so alone in there. So scared. And you were there. Every night. Reading to me. Talking to me. You made me feel like I mattered, like someone cared if I lived or died. Why did you do that for me? I'm nobody. I have no family, no one who would even know I was gone. Why did you care?" And that's when Helen, after 25 years of keeping her secret, of carrying her mission silently, finally told someone why. She told Robert about Marcus. About the coma, the 2 hours he'd been alone, the guilt that had nearly destroyed her. About the promise she'd made to herself that no other coma patient at St. Luke's would ever be alone on her watch. That every person deserved a voice in their darkness, deserved to know someone cared, deserved to feel less alone. She told Robert that she'd been reading to coma patients for 25 years, that he was just one of hundreds, but that each one mattered. Each one was her way of making sure Marcus hadn't been alone in vain. Robert was devastated and moved. He asked Helen if he could tell his story to the hospital administration, to honor what she'd been doing. Helen was reluctant, but Robert insisted. He said what she'd been doing was extraordinary, that people needed to know. So with Helen's permission, Robert shared his experience with the medical director of St. Luke's. The story of the nurse who'd spent 25 years reading to coma patients every night, and how that dedication had saved his life. The medical director was stunned. She'd known Helen for years, knew about the reading habit, but never knew the depth of it or the reason behind it. She asked Helen if she could share the story more widely. Helen agreed, knowing her retirement was weeks away. The hospital held a special ceremony honoring Helen for her 25 years of service, specifically highlighting her work with coma patients. Staff who'd worked with her for decades learned for the first time why she'd always stayed late, why she'd always been in the ICU with the alone patients. Family members of former patients reached out, saying they'd always wondered about the kind nurse who'd sat with their loved ones. But the most powerful moment came during the ceremony when Robert Hayes stood up to speak. He was still weak, still using a walker, but he insisted on addressing the room. He said, "Helen Richardson gave me a gift I can never repay. She gave me proof that even in our darkest moments, even when we think we're completely alone, there are angels walking among us. People who carry their own pain and transform it into service. People who show up for strangers without expectation of recognition or reward." Helen lost her son 25 years ago, and instead of letting that grief destroy her, She used it to make sure no one else felt the abandonment she imagined her son felt. That's not just nursing. That's love in its purest form. And I want everyone here to know that the voice I heard in my coma, the voice that kept me alive, wasn't just reading words. It was speaking hope. It was saying, "You matter. You're not alone. Someone sees you." That's what Helen has been saying to hundreds of people for 25 years. And we need more people like her in this world. We need more people who transform their pain into purpose. The room erupted in applause. Helen was crying. So was half the staff. And in that moment, Helen felt something she hadn't felt since Marcus died. Not the absence of grief, but the knowledge that she'd honored his memory in a way that mattered. That the 2 hours Marcus had been alone had become 25 years of making sure others weren't. That was the equation. That was the balance. That was how she'd survived. Helen retired a month later, but her legacy at St. Luke's continues. The hospital established the Marcus Richardson Memorial Fund, providing resources for music therapy, reading programs, and companion services for ICU patients without family present. Volunteers now continue Helen's work, reading to coma patients, making sure no one is alone. Helen visits regularly, still reads to patients when she can, but now she also mentors the volunteers, teaching them that this work isn't just about the patients. It's about transforming your own pain into someone else's comfort. Robert Hayes recovered fully and became one of those volunteers. He says that Helen saved his life, so now he wants to save others the same way. He visits St. Luke's 3 times a week, sits with coma patients, reads to them, talks to them, makes sure they hear a human voice. He says he remembers how crucial that was in his own darkness. He's paying it forward. That's how love works. It ripples outward. Today, Helen is 68 years old, spending time with David, tending her garden, and visiting St. Luke's to read to patients. She still thinks about Marcus every day. The grief never completely goes away. But it has a purpose now. It has meaning. She turned the worst thing that ever happened to her into the most beautiful thing she ever did. She made sure her son's death wasn't meaningless. She made sure his brief life touched hundreds of other lives. That's the power we all have when tragedy strikes. We can let it destroy us, or we can let it transform us into people who make sure others don't suffer the way we did. And that's the lesson Helen wants people to know. If you're carrying pain, if you're carrying guilt or grief or regret, you can transform it. You can take that darkness and turn it into light for someone else. You don't have to do something grand. Helen just read books out loud. That's all. But she did it consistently, faithfully, for 25 years. And in doing so, she saved lives, comforted families, and honored her son's memory in the most meaningful way possible. So if you're watching this and you've lost someone, if you're carrying pain that feels unbearable, ask yourself, how can I transform this? How can I take what hurt me and use it to help someone else? Maybe you volunteer at a hospital. Maybe you donate to a cause. Maybe you simply show up for people who are alone. Whatever it is, do it in honor of the person you lost. Do it consistently. Do it without expecting recognition. And watch how that transforms not just the people you help, but yourself. That's what Helen did. That's what we can all do. Turn pain into purpose. Turn grief into grace. Turn the worst day of your life into 25 years of making sure others have someone present on their worst days. Helen Richardson never got her son back. But she made sure hundreds of other people got a voice in their darkness. She made sure they weren't alone. And in doing so, she discovered that neither was she. The voice she gave to others became the voice that saved her own life. That's the gift. That's the miracle. That's what love does when we're brave enough to let it transform our pain into purpose. And that's why Helen spent 25 years reading to people who couldn't respond. Because love doesn't need a response. It just needs to be given. And sometimes, just sometimes, that love comes back in ways you never expected. Like a man named Robert Hayes waking up from a coma and reminding you that every hour you spent mattered. Every word you read was heard. Every moment you showed up made a difference. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.